This audiobook podcast comes with an attached picture book. When you hear this sound, turn the page. Let's try it out. You should now be looking at the page with the number 52 displayed. If you are not looking at the page with the number 52 displayed, you have made a mistake. The picture book can be found in the description. Please enjoy the audiobook podcast. Media representation is something particularly important to those who lack it. Most simply, representation is the portrayal of a group in the media. It is truth diluted through its capture and the bias of the artist. This is worth looking into because representation is important for the people represented. And due to the scarcity of representation of minority groups in the media, every text which features them has more importance. I will be analysing the representation of the Maori warrior. A warrior has the dictionary definition of someone whose occupation is warfare, but this could refer to anyone involved in responding to conflict. Maori people in this case. I will analyse texts which feature this, particularly a portrait of Pātara Te Tuhi by C.F. Goldie, painted in the early 1900s, and the 1994 film Once Were Warriors, directed by Lee Tamahori. These texts suggest that Maori are a dying race, once noble, and impact Maori through the stereotype and long-term cultural alienation. Where shall we begin? C.F. Goldie was a Pākehā artist who specialised in portraits. Much of his famous work, however, were not of important Pākehā or European figures, of which he did draw, but prominent Maori chiefs and other Maori peoples. This is one of his paintings. The handsome fellow is Pātara Te Tuhi. His father's cousin was Poutato Te Wherowhero, the first Maori king, and Tuhi's second cousin was Te Wherowhero's successor. Pātara Te Tuhi was secretary to the Maori king and a leader of the Waikato. Needless to say, he was a prominent figure. He can be considered a Maori warrior as he contested colonial actions he saw as in violation of the Treaty of Waitangi, and he had his portrait done by Goldie at around 1908. He is a Maori warrior, and he is old. The heitiki around his neck is a taonga that typically suggests status and or fertility. The lighting is high-key, with contrasting shadows causing shadows under the eyes. This conceals some of the emotion the subject is feeling. It is a technique used in Japanese anime. His expression itself is quite somber. The lighting accentuates this. His reason for sorrow can be parsed through observation of the contemporary ideas of the early 20th century Pākehā towards Maori. You see, this man is old, his grip is weak, and the hair which isn't grey is bald. The lighting isolates him on a black background. Popular belief at the time was that Maori were dying and soon will be gone completely. Quote, "The Maori are dying fast, nothing can save them. Our plain duty as compassionate colonists is to smooth out the dying pillar of the Maori. Then history will have nothing to reproach us with." That was said in 1856 by Sir Isaac, once Dr. Featherston. It was quoted by the Southland Times in 1900. And that is the implication of the techniques in the painting. The Maori are dying, and Tuhi is coming to grips with the death of his people and his culture. Seeing this in society at the time, you would be inclined to think that the only Maori left alive are as aged as this man here. It neglects to show any youth, any Maori children. This is quite a negative portrayal. The origin of the myth was Maori population growth appeared to be declining due to the high death rates from European introduced disease. Tiara.government.nz, the New Zealand Encyclopedia of New Zealand, explains that the belief at the time was based on Darwin's theory on the origin of species, that the race with the superior genetics was the one that would outlive the other. Now, is this representation intentional or the result of unconscious bias? These ideas were the ideas of the society, not necessarily C.F. Goldie's. Well, Goldie's portfolio contains many old Maori figures. Here are some of his famous portraits. All three are Maori, and all three are old. The first painting is an urbanized Maori, looking quite cheerful. The second sleeps with a face that could seem mournful, and the third is unequivocally sad. The second seems to be a portrait of Te Tuhi, made in the similar style as the portrait we've analysed before, with deep shadows and a dark background. To be fair, I also found this portrait, made at a similar time to the rest, showing a younger subject. I believe Goldie had an interest in painting the older Maori figures. His portfolio containing them continues to 1948, well after the myth of the dying race had been debunked. The purpose of these texts may just be an artistic representation of these peoples, but unconsciously it is likely he, along with the rest of New Zealand society, viewed the Maori, and therefore the Maori warrior, as a dying race. The Maori warrior in Goldie's works often do not fight. Indeed, as portrait paintings, they are devoid of physical conflict or any movement whatsoever. The one who fights with his fists is Jake the Muss. Once Were Warriors began as a controversial book and then a widely acclaimed film. Author Alan Duff purposely used the English translation of Rotorua, Two Lakes, to give the book wider appeal to international audiences. Once Were Warriors is described on the poster as a sledgehammer of the film, and that is an apt judgment. The film is a slice of life following the Heke family, centered on the violent Jake the Muss, who is abusive in multiple ways to his wife, Beth Heke. Jake the Muss can be considered a Maori warrior of sorts, though very different to Te Tuhi. Jake has a tendency to violence. In an early scene, he watches a tough guy beat a man down.
Check that out, bro. Man can sure pack a punch.
Been behind bars, I bet.
Yeah, right. Bloody zoo.
The man has a barbed wire tattoo wrapped around his forehead. Jake the Muss executes this tough guy swiftly, and later on we see he too has a similar barbed wire tattoo in his bicep, wrapping around it 3 times. Note that this tattoo is largely absent before the first violent scene between Beth and Jake, where we see Jake's bad side. Before this scene, his costume included a red shirt, later removed at some point before the first violent episode. Under this flannel is revealed to be a black wife-beater shirt, the same as the tough guy was wearing in the earlier scene. The comparisons here are intentional to code Jake as violent and similar to this thuggish tough guy we saw him dispatch. The scene all takes place in a bar, a frequent location for Jake. One point in the film which displays this is after Jake's second son, Boogie, has been taken away to live in a boarding house. Here, he is mentored by a Maori social worker who teaches him the haka. It is a healthy relationship and portrayed as a healthy environment. Hard cut. Jake is in the bar, drinking. His son has a new father figure, and the filmmaking blames the drink. It is a strong juxtaposition of a nurturing father and an absent one. The stereotypes here are plain. Jake the Muss drinks and is violent. A prevailing stereotype of Maori, particularly frequent for Maori warriors, is that they are violent and cannot control themselves due in part to their alcoholism. This is a negative representation. Jake is not fighting for any cause in particular. He is just violent. If one is to use Jake as a typical example, then all Maori drink too much and are dangerous. This is an issue because the film does not feature any Maori characters in a positive light, nor any Pākehā characters to counter the notion. Not all Maori drink, and Pākehā surely are capable of abuse and the like. But because of the nature of the story, we only see a snapshot of this Maori family. It can make alcoholism and abuse seem to be a purely Maori problem, instead of a humanity problem or a poverty problem. These stereotypes of violent drunken Maori exist. The first documented gangs were created by white people who wanted community, and ethnic-based gangs such as the one we're most familiar with in New Zealand began because Maori and other minority groups felt disenfranchised, alienated, and economically deprived. Often, these were because of the intergenerational effects of colonialism. The Encyclopedia of New Zealand. Ethnic gangs began to form in the 1960s as Maori became urbanized and lost touch with tribal communities. The film is set in an urban period in the Maori-dominated city area of South Auckland. Some gangs have a tendency to commit crimes, and the Maori-dominated clans birth stereotypes that Maori are dangerous. Alcohol abuse is also a stereotype of Maori, but the reason is more economic. Here is a quote from a study commissioned to investigate the relationship between alcohol and income. Studies have found that people in deprived neighborhoods may be more likely to both abstain from alcohol than those in affluent neighborhoods, and more commonly adopt heavier patterns of consumption, such as binge drinking. It is complicated, but heavier alcohol use patterns are most likely to occur in lower income areas, such could be South Auckland, where our film is set. Jake comments upon losing his job.
I got lucky. I got laid off.
What?
Whoa, woman, let me finish.
Hey, Kiki, you've got a family to feed. You've got
Look,
bills
I've
to...
signed up for the dole. It's only $17 a week less than my wages. Well, don't look like that. It's not the end of the world.
Proving they are in a poor income bracket. Note that the quote specifies that people in impoverished communities are more likely to both indulge in heavier drinking patterns, but also abstain from alcohol. This would mean that many Maori in impoverished communities would not drink alcohol at all, and these groups are not shown at all in the film. Research has found that people living in the most deprived communities may be more likely than those in affluent communities to adopt risky drinking patterns. That is how these associations occur. Maori typically earn less than Pākehā. Here is a graph from the Ministry of Social Development detailing the disparities in equalized household income over time. Note how European is notably higher than Maori and Pacific peoples. The purpose of Once Were Warriors is to show the effect of losing touch with culture and the target audience is Maori. The text is supposed to be didactic, a call to action. The loss of culture in this urban environment has led to the suffering of Maori, and they can change their circumstances if they were to rekindle that connection. Responsibility is put on the Maori audience to enact it themselves. We'll just have to see how it was interpreted. Goldie as an artist was not widely respected. Granted he was talented, and granted he was recognized as talented, but his photorealistic style was considered too photographic, and considering his style conservative and outdated. Dr. Jeanne S.M. Willett from Art History Unstuffed wrote of the time period, "By the beginning of the new century, realism was effectively defunct, and expressionism surged forward to replace it." This is in reference to trends in Europe, but due to immigration and the non-Maori population nearly doubling over the period of 1891 to 1915, they likely shared the sentiment. However, according to this article, many Maori do feel a connection to the paintings. Indeed, the descendants of many of the tupuna, ancestors, who grace Goldie's canvases often feel such overwhelming affection for the portraits that they have been known to confide in or pray to them, to kiss or hongi the images, and to weep silently in their presence. It would seem by this account that some Maori do not care that the representation so negatively suggests the Maori race was in the brink of death. At this late date, art critics have noted the implications of Goldie's work, but perhaps because the artistry, or perhaps because of the lack of materials featuring these figures, there is still a strong response in positive reaction. Now, this reaction wouldn't be the same if the representation was more overtly problematic, such as in American minstrel shows, which wouldn't really die out until the next decade. I would think the reason for the difference in reaction is that a painting critic, especially at the time, would not have any emotional or cultural connection to the people featured in the paintings. If I were to speculate, then there could even be some bias against Maori by the critics. It is important to note that all this discourse happened 100 years ago, which means that the records of their reactions will be scattered and incomplete. Maori being in mostly rural communities also meant that their reactions would be harder to find. This is not the case for Once We're Warriors. Once We're Warriors was a controversial book, then a controversial film. In an interview between Stuff and Duff, I said, "I'm going to write this hard-hitting book, but if you think it's going to be a disservice to our people, I won't write it." The elder responded, "You write what your heart tells you," so I went ahead. In the same interview, Duff was almost regretful. "No, I wouldn't write Once We're Warriors again. I want to bring back more pride to Maoridom and recognize the things we've done, so every Maori kid can say, 'Hey, that's me.' They don't want to see a Jake." The Encyclopedia of New Zealand singles out Once We're Warriors as a symbol of the stereotype of violent Maori. One Cheryl Ferguson said, "This movie was very influential in the labeling of Maori as violent individuals who indulged in alcohol and wife-bashing on a weekly basis." Alan Duff, "I wrote the story on behalf of the Beths and the Graces and the Boogies and everyone else in that situation." And that's the problem with our analysis. We are viewing Jake as the Maori warrior and not Beth. A Maori warrior is one occupied by conflict, warfare, and Beth Heke is battling to keep her dignity while living with Jake, the Mas. Beginning of the film, she wears a dress, symbolically a traditional woman's clothing. At the end, she is wearing a vest and trousers, showing she has more agency, and is leaving the subservient role behind. She smokes cigarettes and is seen drinking alcohol, even in the morning. It is shown to make her angry. Unlike Jake, she does not act out in violence as a result. She fights by standing up to Jake and confronting him on many occasions, even though he is going to physically dominate her almost every time she does it. She says this, proposing an alternate meaning to Maori warrior.
Fuck off then. You get nothing from me.
You've got nothing I want. Our people, once were warriors, but not like you, Jake. They were people with mana, pride, people with spirit. If my spirit can survive living with you for 18 years, then I can survive anything. Maybe you taught me that.
Oh, you're fucked, lady. Really fucked. You think I need you in your fucking spirit? Fuck off. Go on, go. I don't want you, ever! I'll knock your fucking head off! Fuck you, you'll be back! Fuck this warrior shit! You'll be back! Fuck you, Beth! Do you hear me, Beth?
Mana can be gained through praise and success, or lost through failure. It is pride, honor, and influence. Jake Heke lacks this, perhaps because he is a failure. He has just been laid off, and all he does is drink, party, and abuse his wife. There is no honor there, nor value of honor. Beth's maintains dignity as a sign of her mana. It can be seen to play into the stereotype of the noble Maori warrior of pre-colonial New Zealand. In this fashion, Once We're Warriors embraces Pitt River's declaration that Maori had all the vices and none of the virtues of their ancestors. It is argued that the film depicts the fall of Maori from a noble or culturally romanticized people to a more contemporary, urbanized degenerate. Beth's drinking and cigarette use is another example of stereotype, and it can be explained by the same statistics of alcohol used in impoverished communities as Jake's. Research has found that people living in the most deprived communities may be more likely than those in affluent communities to adopt risky drinking patterns. The Maori reaction to Beth differs greatly from the reaction to her spouse. Rena Owens, who played Beth, said,
It's a universal story, this story, and everyone can relate to a Beth in their own country.
In his article, Cinematic Myth in the Maori, David Matthew writes, "One of the things I find most disturbing about warriors is the familiarity of the Heke family. They could have easily been part of my own extended whānau." Beth's representation seems to have captured some reality, as it has a resonance with Māori of the time despite the negative portrayal of alcohol and cigarette use. It is similar to how the quality of Goldie's painting allowed for the dismissal of the unscientific assumptions behind it. These stereotypes are not altered or subverted, and the representation is still largely negative, but it is perhaps the more positive ending which allows this to be ignored. Beth gets away. Jake is left alone. The perpetual violence is ended. Timuera Morrison, who played Jake Heke,
and I suppose it's true to say that it could be a story about a Chinese family, a Red Indian family, a Scottish family, a Irish families, within the same predicament, a family at the bottom end of a socio-economic scale, universally can't be too much different from anywhere else in the world.
However, the film cannot escape the subjects being Maori. Jake is still shown as a violent, aggressive warrior, and Beth is also shown as aggressive, and both are still shown to have trouble with alcohol. Where the Goldie artwork's issues were quickly disproven by facts and disregarded by society, Once We're Warriors serves as a readily able to perpetuate these stereotypes as a norm. Goldie's warriors are unlikely to harm the everyday Maori citizen, but seeing the violent and aggressive warriors in a ways which presents it as realistic could incite more feelings of shame, a reduction in pride for their heritage. David Matthew, the author of Cinematic Myth in the Maori, which I mentioned before, also had this to say. "So yes, I admire warriors as aesthetically as a pleasing piece of kinetic art, but I would not use it as a measuring stick for reality. Although the Heke family and their milieu may reflect a reality to some extent, is a predominantly negative and, I believe, one-sided view. Having personally experienced many of the positive aspects of Māori culture, I would deplore this film's portrayal of my race if it weren't for the fact it was made by a Māori. I would think that we are doomed as a race if we continue to view ourselves in such a harsh and unforgiving light. I think we need to see a positive reply to this film. We live in hope." It reminds me of what podcast host 17 said when discussing the representations of LGBT figures in anime on the Our Anime podcast.
Right, and it's also a
makes
question
sense.
of frequency more than it is anything else, right? If you had perfect representation, these things wouldn't be bad in microcosm. But the fact that this is how you frequently see these people represented is when it becomes something problematic. But anyway, but yeah, I don't think Hisoka is a bad thing necessarily on his own. More is something that's emblematic of kind of a larger issue that makes certain narrative choices problematic just for the fact that a lot of other people are also making those narrative choices.
These representations can have good intentions, but the nature of the representations can have unintended or unwanted results. But how long into the future could these stereotypes last or affect? Once We're Warriors, as I previously mentioned, tells of a once nobler race now suffering from the results of urbanization, lacking the qualities of their noble past. Goldie's art suggests that the race of Maori are dying out. Together, they paint a picture of a once noble race that is dying out and leaving behind urban products such as Jake the Muss and Beth Heke. They can reconnect to their culture, but largely the noble warrior is dead, if not dying. The impact of representation such as this is that Māori could feel mournful or disappointed for themselves. They are being told their culture is dying. They could even begin to feel more alienated from their culture than they already are, as the media is telling it once was a far different image from reality that is now gone. The results of cultural alienation could mean a rise in gang membership. Ethnic gangs began to form in the 1960s as Maori became urbanized and lost touch with tribal communities. Various explanations exist for the formation of indigenous and ethnic minority gangs, including social exclusion, cultural alienation. This in turn could result in more Maori in the prison systems, which would become a cycle of alienation and social exclusion, increased gang membership, increased Maori imprisonment, increased alienation and social exclusion, and so on. This could alternatively lead to more mental health problems to face the Maori people. To have the Maori population face more troubles with gang and mental health would be a negative development for the future. The loss of cultural practices can lead to reduced social cohesion and society-wide mental health challenges, because an individual's culture is closely linked with their sense of identity and belonging in a group. Once We're Warriors posits this was already occurring, but it could accidentally act as an accelerator to the issue. The effect of this could be a furthering of the divide between Pākehā and Māori. Māori would become more held back and economically disadvantaged due to their mental health, while Pākehā would continue without. A society more divided by race and more divided economically would be a development for New Zealand. This change in economics and the change in mental health could even further stereotypes that Māori are violent and alcohol abusive. I would expect this would be reflected in the representation, with even so-called realistic stories on the Māori experience featuring the negative representations of Māori more prominently. Cultural alienation could also see less Māori people engaging with Māori culture, causing it to genuinely begin to disappear as they feel less and less of a connection to it. The cultural diversity in New Zealand would be lost, which may come to negatively affect our tourism industry, which relies heavily on the image of multiculturalism, among other things. This hit to the tourism industry would alter society heavily. Link business. While language is perceived as a cultural boundary between China and New Zealand, it's often the culture itself that draws Chinese tourists to visit. Chinese tourists are often interested in the Maori culture. There could be a loss in Chinese tourism, a relationship that contemporary governments value strongly. Maori culture would exist in museums, less romantic and exciting to tourists, or artificially on display to entice tourists. That could even lead to more alienation for Māori. My recommendation to amend these issues is to feature more positive representations. As Podcaster 17 said, if we had the perfect representation, these things wouldn't be bad in microcosms. We need to show more Māori people connecting with their culture in a positive way, and some more positive stories of the Māori experience. Aspects of this representation should be implemented. Māori people in tune with their culture. Non-violent or aggressive Māori. Māori with healthy drinking and smoking habits. Perhaps the NZ government will want to consider using their film grants to fund more Māori directors with these intentions. Help support the new representation. You may think this is easily exploitable. I just need to show a Māori dude be stable and I get grant money. I retort, how is this a problem? There will be incentive to show Māori positively. And if the government supports Māori directors at the same time, we will still get stories of the Māori experience, if not more. The only difference is that the negative representations will not be the only representations. This will help counter the problems which result. Reducing cultural alienation could lessen Māori gang indoctrination rates, mental health problems caused by the loss of identity, present the loss of culture, and subsequently loss in tourism. More positive representation will reduce the expectation that Māori men must be masculine, and in so will help said men progress to healthy adulthood. In conclusion, Once We're Warriors and the portrait of Patara Te Tuhi show negative representations of the Māori warrior as a once noble, now dying race, plagued by alcohol and violence. I reflected on how the public reactions to these texts shows how it will impact the groups, and the long-term impact of the loss of cultural identity and diversity, with a solution of increasing funding for film projects with positive Māori representation by Māori directors. Representation is important, especially when you lack it. So then it's important to give good representations to groups commonly not given such, lest there be consequences.